All right, Vaughn, thanks so much. 1 week ago, a Colleton County jury convicted Alec Murdaugh for the murders of his wife and son, Maggie and Paul, in what was South Carolina's trial of the century. The lead prosecutor in the case said it was a perfect storm that led Murdock to kill his flesh and blood on that night, June the 7th, 2021. In the end, it took the jury just under 3 hours to agree and convict Murdock of double murder. Creighton Waters joining us now live on your news at 5:30. Thank you so much for taking time out. Have you caught your breath after all that?
Not really. Still working on that.
Still working on it.
It's been a week, I guess, almost since we got the verdict, but it's still a process. You know, it's hard to turn that off after such an intense trial for not just me, but the whole team as well.
Yeah, well, congratulations to you, first of all, for earning that conviction. Certainly an uphill climb. 6 weeks, so much evidence, and really at the end, you said that Alec Murdaugh himself, and it would appear that jurors agreed, was ultimately the key to all of this. His testimony, when he took the stand and testified, it seemed that something changed in all that. Take us through your cross-examination of Alec Murdaugh. Talk about the preparation and just that experience of being able to go toe-to-toe with him in this case.
Sure. Well, you know, in studying this case and doing this financial investigation as well on top of the murders for so long, and of course we didn't get involved until September, the Attorney General's office, we really got a sense of this guy and who he had been, the family he had been a part of, and it just seemed very, very likely that he was going to try to testify because he believed very strongly that he'd be able to convince those jurors. He'd be able to look them in the eye and, as I kept saying, lie effortlessly and convincingly. And I think if you watch that direct, you know, those jurors were riveted by his testimony because he is a very convincing person and can be. But as that cross started, I really went about it a different way than you would with a cross. It was not going to be one where I try to dominate the conversation, but I wanted to get him talking. I had pauses for a reason because he would just start to bring up things on his own. And I felt if we did that over a long period of time, eventually he would start to lie in real time in front of the jury, and they would see that for themselves. And so I think that was a turning point in the case as we went through the entire process.
Yeah, that was one thing that you were pointing out to the jury. It was interesting to see Alec Murdaugh turn to jurors in his direct, but in the cross, he was looking directly at you. You also said in your closing argument that, or at least at one point in the trial, when you said it seemed like he was glaring at you from time to time during that trial. What was that like?
Well, you know, they say eyes are the window to the soul, and he can be very convincing, but I also, I think there was one time when I asked him the ultimate question. I asked if he was a family annihilator, and that was a different way to ask sort of the ultimate question, but he got very, very intense, and you could really see that in his eyes. Alec, during the trial, he's a big guy, he's bigger than I am, he liked to stare me down as we would pass each other in that very tight confine, and you know, when that would happen, I could get really a sense of this man, and frankly, it was a little chilling.
Yeah, you know, this case didn't have maybe some of the typical forensic evidence that a case has. Some of the uphill challenges that your team faced, really, you know, a lack of DNA or blood evidence, or, you know, the guns were never found in this case. Ultimately, what you relied on was technology. Cell phones, and ultimately one kennel video in many ways seemed to loom so large in this trial. His voice on that tape, did it surprise you at just how convincing it was? Because we've heard from jurors saying that ultimately were you confident throughout this that would be enough?
Well, you know, we had some other evidence as well, but we call this the CSI Effect. People watch the show and they believe that every case has, you know, some sort of magic type forensic evidence, and it doesn't always. But I think you recall during my opening, I pulled out my cell phone and said, there's a different type of forensic evidence, and that's the cell phone. There was not just the kennel video, but the timeline as well. But I think that kennel video was crucial, because how do you explain, and obviously he was unable to explain, you know, being at the murder scene with the victims just moments before they died, and then of course lying about it. That's very compelling evidence. You know, with the firearms, we didn't have the actual guns, but we were able to show that it was a family weapon that was missing. And when you put that in the context of a guy who's a part-time prosecutor who comes through from 100 years of legacy as a prosecutor in his family, who is a lawyer who's done complex cases that rely on digital evidence and that sort of stuff, you could see how this man was manufacturing this crime scene. And so ultimately you take take a weakness and you make it a strength.
Yeah, you had so much, it seemed like a lot of evidence that at times, let's face it, especially as you brought in the financial evidence as it was allowed to be introduced in this trial, it could get tedious, it could get technical. Was there any conversation ahead of closing arguments, especially how are we going to bring this all together, and then of course making a convincing case in that closing argument to the jury, how to connect with them, because you used a couple of lines in that closing where you said that Maggie was running to her baby, and just all of those by design, or walk us through that a little bit.
Sure. Well, it was a lot to bring together after 6 weeks. You know, the financial evidence wasn't as simple as people like to make it out to be. I think I used, and you said it as well, the gathering storm, and during my opening there was a storm approaching as we talked about those themes. The financial aspect, and it was multi-layered, that family legacy, the use of opiates, the destruction of this 100 years of a family legacy, facing complete ruin, facing shame in front of his family. I asked him once, you know, shame is a real provocation for you, isn't it, Mr. Murdock? All these things were converging together on June 7th. But that was just one part of it, and if you remember how I talked about it in closing, you know, it's really good old-fashioned investigative work. We talked about motive, we talked about means, the family weapons, we talked about opportunity, and went through the fact that he's at the crime scene, and then that timeline, which I think is very compelling, that he's trying to manufacture that alibi. And then we talked about acts of one who was guilty, and of course lying about the kennel video being one of the main one of those, but there was a number of those as well. So when you isolated out with those very factors, you were able to take all the things that have been brought in and put them in a category that makes sense, that all roads lead back to Alec. That's what we try to do, at least.
Yeah, now Judge Newman allowed that motive evidence. Murdock's defense counsel has since said that they didn't think that Alec Murdaugh got a fair trial, and in fact we just heard today that his team has officially filed an appeal in this case. What do you think about that move today? Do you think that that really has any water at this point? Does it hold any water? And how will that play out?
Well, I spent the first part of my career as an appellate lawyer, and so what they did was file a notice of appeal. It has to be filed within 10 days. It's a very short, formal document that transfers jurisdiction from the lower court to the appellate court, and it's going to start in place a very long, but it's a process that every criminal defendant that faces, you know, conviction like this goes through. And so we'll go through that process. We're very confident. Judge Newman is an excellent judge. He considered that evidence very carefully. We were careful, actually, to bring it up ahead of time and say, this is what we're going to do. And we made the defense aware of it, we made the judge aware of it, and the judge considered that and ruled it in. This case is unique, and I think that if there's a case to you know, determine what are the appropriate limits of that other crimes evidence, we call it Rule 404B evidence, this is the case for that, because this is such a unique situation, and the jury really needed to understand all those various factors and how they were all converging on Alec that day in order to understand, you know, what is it about this guy who could possibly lead him to commit these terrible acts.
So what do you think is next here as the investigations surrounding Alec Murdaugh continue? Other financial victims seeking justice, the families of Gloria Satterfield, Stephen Smith also looking for answers. How active will you be in that process moving forward?
All right. So I'm, you know, as chief attorney of the state grand jury, we're the ones who, of course, brought the 99 financial charges. And to be clear, he's entitled to a fair trial on those. He's presumed to be innocent on those. But those have a value as well beyond just the murders of Maggie and Paul. And I want to be clear, Maggie and Paul were the most important thing. That's the question that was answered here. But there are other alleged victims out there that deserve a voice as well. And in the state grand jury, we look for cases that have an effect beyond just the case itself. So if in doing that we can expose issues of too much influence in the system, corruption in the system. We're talking about a lawyer who abused the trust that comes along with a law license to allegedly commit fraud on an unparalleled scale. So there's issues to be addressed there, and hopefully broader good can come of exposing those sorts of things. So we plan to pursue those aggressively, and certainly we will be involved in all of that going along the way. As far as other things, I certainly can't comment on any other pending investigation that has yet to be charged or indicted.
Yeah, certainly. And of course, we could probably talk with you for, you know, a good hour about this case and of all the different factors and facets. But you know, one thing that we do regret is that we didn't bring in a guitar for you, because this man
you didn't ask me.
Yes, can certainly wail on the guitar. We have some video of you right here. It looks like you playing with your bandmates. Glad to be back with them, and you said you're playing a gig tonight.
Well, no, this will be my first practice since being back, so I'll get to hang out with my buddies and have a soda pop or two and play a little rock and roll.
Well, you know, you certainly deserve it, and again, congratulations. Creighton Waters, the lead prosecutor in the Alec Murdaugh trial, joining us right here on your news at 5:30 on WIS. Thank you so much, and enjoy at least a brief breather between now and the next step.
Enjoyed talking with you.
You bet. Thanks so much. We'll be right back after this.